Hey guys, welcome to the Lean to the Left podcast, where we talk about progressive politics and the important social issues of our time. Today, we're looking at leadership in what some might think is an unlikely resource, the LGBTQ plus community. So stay with us.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no-holds-barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people, some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now here's your host, Bob Gaddy.
Our guest today is Dr. Joel A. Davis-Brown, the Chief Visionary Officer of Pneumos, LC, a management consulting and coaching firm based in San Francisco and Nairobi, Kenya, specializing in organizational strategy and culture, transformational leadership, global inclusion, executive coaching, conflict resolution, and strategic storytelling. That's a lot. Anyway, Joel is the author of a new book, The Soul of Queer Folk: How Understanding the LGBTQ plus Culture Can Transform Your Leadership Practice. He's also the co-founder of Meta Principle TN, a global institute designed to train practitioners on how to facilitate equity work anywhere around the world. Joel is an adjunct professor at the IESEG School of Management in Paris and Lille, France, where he teaches storytelling for leaders and story listening. As a change agent, Joel works strategically to cultivate innovative, creative, and adaptive environments where the cultural genius of everyone can be harnessed and leveraged successfully. Dr. Davis-Brown, thanks so much for joining us today on the Lean to the Left podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for reading all that. I know that was a mouthful, and feel free to just call me Joel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, I'll do that. It looks to me like I asked you if you were on the West Coast and you said you're bi-coastal. It looks to me like you're you're like, not bi-world, there's only one world, but you're talking about Kenya and France, and you're going to all these places to do your work. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm pretty fortunate to be able to move around the world and to experience different cultures and to know what's going on from a global perspective. I think is really important. And so I enjoy my time. I enjoy my time when I'm home and I'm not on a plane, trust me. And I also enjoy when I'm at my homes abroad, because at this point, Paris in particular and East Africa feel like homes outside of the Western Hemisphere. So I feel pretty fortunate. I have community all across the world at this point, and they help to keep me grounded and informed, which I think is important for all of us.
That's great. So tell me this, why did you name your book, The Souls of Queer Folk? When I saw that, I thought to myself, what the hell could this be about?
Well, when you think about LGBTQ people, I still think our society fundamentally misunderstands what our community stands for. And so in attempting to answer that question, I wanted to really get at what I think is the soul, the essence, the core of who we are as a people. And of course, anytime you do an ethnographic study, you can't say that you can't provide what I would say, a complete accounting of any community or any culture, but I think you can make reasonable efforts to do. And so this was my attempt to humanize the community, especially at a time when our community is under attack, and to really get back to basics and to really help, I think, create a new narrative, one that is informed by the community as opposed to one that's informed or created by people outside the community, especially those who are hostile to us. So that's why I named it. It harkens back to a book written by W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk, that talked about, and at the time, a quintessential book and reading on race and race relations in the States. And I'm hoping that this book will help to reset and reframe how we look at the queer community as a whole.
Well, that's a great explanation. I'm wondering, it seems to me that today we're seeing a lot more violence, a lot more action that is harmful to the LGBTQ plus community. Do you agree it's gotten worse? And if so, why has it gotten worse?
I think it's being documented more. Certainly since 2018, we've seen unprecedented violence against the trans community, particularly trans women of color, in places like the US, Mexico, Brazil, and the UK. So I think it's more documented. I think, however, I would be surprised if we didn't see similar levels in, let's say, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's just a matter of whether there was reporting on these issues. But to your question, why is this happening? I think anytime you have, and we've seen this cyclically over the course of human history, and particularly US history, anytime there is quote unquote advances in equity and advances in progressive politics, if you will, there's always a backlash. And I think it's become sport, unfortunately, for a number of factions in our country to denigrate queer people because it helps to raise money, helps generate clicks, it helps to get people riled up. Even when we have officials who are not talking about the substantive issues that are affecting our country and our youth and our people. So, for example, we know that the leading cause of death for young people, I believe between ages of 18 and 24, is gun violence. So why are we focusing on things like drag shows and why are we focusing on pronouns and gender affirming care? It's because it's a fundraiser. And I think there are a number of people now, unfortunately, and I think this has always been the case, but more so now, whose sole purpose is to distract because they know that they cannot run on the merits. They know that they don't have anything substantive to talk about. And so it's a way for them to stay relevant, to stay in power. And queer people have always been, for whatever reason, easy scapegoats because we still are a relatively marginalized community. So, given the stakes and given what's happened over the last, I would say, 10 years, probably longer than that, I think this is an opportunity for people to raise a flag and say, this is quote unquote leading to the breakdown of our society. This is the latest thing. And it's not just with queer people, with people of color and women as well, and anybody who would call themselves progressive, but this is the core issue or the thing that I think a lot of people like to focus on because they can sensationalize it and they can generate controversy. And it is posing, as you noted, some very negative consequences for our community, which is part of the reason why I think this book is so important. Because at a time when queer people are being dehumanized, the reason why people can perpetrate violence against our community is because they think it's justified, they think it's rational, and they think that our community is somehow subhuman or substandard or second class. So that's why it's important for us to reaffirm and to reintroduce ourselves to a community that exists in every aspect of American and global life, but a community that, for whatever reason, continues to be seen as something less than.
Joel, do you see this? Do you lay this at the feet of any particular political party or politician?
That's a very good question. One I've not been asked before. I think it's too simple to say that you can lay it at the feet of a one political party. If I'm just being honest, I think the Republican Party definitely is doing all it can to support anti-LGBTQ policies, but you also see it borne out by the church. But what we're looking at is a systemic problem, right? So you have some churches, I don't want to say all churches, because I think it's very easy for progressives to see spiritual religious arguments. And I think that there's a number of churches that are open and affirming and inclusive. But when you see conservative churches, when you see the Republican Party, when you see extremists on the right, I think when you have media, I think there are a number of institutions that have created this. And plus, we have a history. And I think all of it together has created what we see, which is this groundswell of anti-LGBTQ sentiment, where you have nearly 600 plus anti-LGBTQ plus bills and pieces of legislation introduced across the US, which is unprecedented given all the issues that we have to deal with right now. So I wish it were as simple as saying it's one, but I definitely think there are some driving forces. And I would say, namely, conservative churches. I would say the conservative political base in this country certainly, I think, bear a huge share of responsibility for what we're seeing. And I think then you have institutions like the media who I think create false equivalencies and don't really do great journalistic work to ask probative questions and to really point out when people are being disingenuous or people are being dishonest. So they become willing or unwitting I won't say co-conspirators, but partners in this game, if you will, of creating a narrative and an idea that somehow one group is just upset for no reason and the other group is justified and they're just trying to honor quote unquote traditional values.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your book,
Sure.
Joel. Why should someone who is not identified as LGBTQ plus read? Why should they read it?
I think leadership right now is at a really crucial point.
Uh-huh.
I think many of us, and maybe I'm maybe I'm one of the few who disagrees, but I don't think so. Our leadership models are failing. We're at a point right now, I mean, we just had last week the former president of the United States be indicted for interfering with an election. Now, I forget the exact causes of action and what the laws were that he broke.
Well, he tried to overturn the election.
So he tried to overturn the election, exactly. So when we've never had that before.
Yeah,
and I
for
think, and if we can look at that, and I think that symbolizes that the kind of self-centered, narcissistic, top-down, hierarchical command and control type of leadership, which is not just present in politics, but it's present in institutions and organizations and communities all around the world, is failing. It's not helping. So, given the problems that we have, what can we do to effect a new form of leadership? When I look at the queer community, I think look at the people who have been persecuted, people who have been at the fringes of society, people who have not had many resources, people who have been disfavored. And yet this community is still able to survive. So if I am an objective, reasonable person, I would say no matter what the group is, if there's a group that's been able to escape persecution, death, and bias and harassment and still do well for itself, there's something in its cultural DNA that I perhaps should want to study, that I should want to examine or research or learn more about. And so that for me is the basis for why anybody I think should be interested in this book is how do you affect greater leadership? And I think we do well when we learn from those around us who have been able to do the things we want to achieve. It doesn't matter if it's LGBTQ plus people, or let's say it's a group in another part of the world, there's something that I think could be beneficial for us all. And so I think that's the opportunity. And as you alluded to, you don't have to be queer to extract wisdom, to leverage guidance, to learn from other groups and say, how can we as a people, how can I as a person be better? So that to me is the opportunity. And of course, leadership doesn't extend just to corporations and businesses and politics. It extends in how we lead ourselves, how we lead our communities, how we lead our families, and how we lead the world.
that last statement, I think, is a very important one. So what are some of the key themes that readers should take away from your book, Joel?
I think the first thing that I would start with is the importance of really examining oneself. The queer community, by virtue of coming out, we have a inborn practice of examining ourselves to say, okay, who are we? What is it that we stand for? What's our purpose? What's our mission? What are our values? Where do we begin and end? Where does society begin and end in terms of its expectations of how we should show up? Leadership is an internal dimension. It must start internally before you can focus on external constituents and people and whatnot. And oftentimes when we think about leadership, and I teach on leadership, people are thinking, how do I reach that person? How do I connect with this group? How do I impress someone? And what I always say to my students and what I always think is important, and I've learned from some really great leaders in my life, is you have to be present with and know who you are first and how you can be a better version of yourself before you can lead others. And if nothing else, I think the queer community has become quite adept at examining itself and interrogating itself to figure out who are we? And when you can really peer into yourself and see who you are and understand what motivates you and what your strengths are and what your quote unquote developmental opportunities are, I think you are then in a better position to lead other people because you've actually done some of the critical internal work, which I see again as being that's been missed by a number of leaders in senior positions across the world and across industry. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is there are a number of different things. We talk about them in the book, but I would say also understanding in terms of this conversation, what it means to exist in community and what it means to also advocate on behalf of others who are less fortunate. We see from the historical record of queer people an abiding faith and support in community, people who are different, people who have been marginalized. And we also see the recognition that justice is not something that you can just speak about philosophically. You have to advocate for it. There has to be an active component. So I would say those three things, if you can just start there in terms of recognizing of being more self-actualized yourself as a leader and as a person, as a human being. Number two, recognizing that there's a connection between all of us and that what I do for myself and what I do for others also impacts the world around us, but also recognizing that supporting justice in the world and such, creating a more just society is something that can't just be born out on social media and it just can't be talked about in private circles. It's something that you actively have to take action to achieve. And so those are some of the key lessons that I think we can learn from the LGBTQ plus community.
Okay, Joel. When you wrote this book, when you began to work on it, who did you have in mind as your target audience, and did that hold true as you finished the manuscript?
It was interesting when I first started writing this book or conceiving this book, I didn't even think of it as a quote unquote leadership book. Initially, it was a cultural attaché. I just wanted to maybe illuminate and illustrate more completely what the community stood for. As I started to learn and to realize and to uncover what some of the values were, I realized, well, a lot of what the community stands for is what we're seeing from people these days in terms of what they want from their leaders. They want their leaders to be more adaptive. They want them to be more inclusive. They want them to be more community minded. So then as I thought about who would this apply to, initially, again, I thought, okay, this could be important in civic and business circles, but really leadership is, again, a personal affect. Has a personal dimension to it. So in reality, it can apply to anybody. And I think the mistake would be for people to think that this is a book that only applies to business or to organizations. It can apply to anyone. So you can read it from the level of how can I be a better person? You can read it from the level of how can I be a better neighbor? And you can read it from the standpoint of how can I be a better leader within an organization if I'm leading or managing a project, or if I'm, let's say, in the C-suite or I'm a senior director of some sort. So it's industry agnostic. It's something that can apply all over the world. And it's something that I think a lot of people can learn from because, again, this community has a record of achievement and success despite some very daunting circumstances. And this community is one that is not only becoming more visible and is emerging, but is present in practically everywhere in the globe. And so I think it behooves us as global citizens to learn from our neighbors, to learn from people around us, and to figure out how we can be better for all of us, particularly for those who have been underrepresented.
What are some of the attributes of the queer community that people can learn from when it comes to leadership?
I think number one, global mindedness. So we're talking from the US. I don't know exactly where you are, but sitting in the US, and just to be more aware of what's happening around us and to recognize again that what happens to others and what happens to other parts of the world is very much important and influential on what happens to me. I think bringing zest and zeal to your leadership practice and to your life and not being satisfied with just getting by, with just surviving, with just doing the very basic things. Learning for ways to reject traditional norms and traditional ways of doing things that have proven to be ineffective. So I talk in the book around gender fluidity. And what does that mean? How can that identity or that attribute of the community, that value, how can it support transformational leadership thinking? Letting go of sacred cows and saying, here are two poles or two polarities that have been presented to me or two ideas, and maybe there's a different way to do things, and being comfortable with rejecting those standard norms and thinking outside the box, reveling in one's creativity, which doesn't mean that you're artistic. It means recognizing that we all have a creative power to think differently and to bring something new into creation. Those are the types of adaptive things that are going to be really important, particularly as we move into a society, as we continue to move deeper into society, where some of the solutions to our problems are not going to be present or ready-made or visible. A lot of the problems that we may engender in the next, let's say, 20, 30 years haven't even surfaced yet, which means that the solutions for those problems have not surfaced yet. So we've got to become more adept at being adaptive, which means not understanding or knowing or having tried and true solutions and being imaginative and creative in order to generate solutions that can impact everyone positively, as opposed to the technical expertise where someone says to you, there's a problem, go to a book or a manual, you read it and say, okay, here's the solution. I just need to get the resources to do that. That type of thinking is not going to help us move forward as a society. So those are the things that I would say are going to be really important that the queer community does naturally, because we've had to, not only in terms of our survival, but in terms of how we also choose to live and how we choose to navigate the world.
Okay. Now, in some of the material that I was sent in preparation for this discussion, I saw the term cultural genius. What is that? And how does it apply to leadership and the theme of your book? We'll hear what Joel has to say about that as soon as we return from this quick break.
I love that you asked that question. So when we think about leadership, and I used to be one of these people too, so I'm not taking myself out of the equation. I sometimes, when I was young, I thought to be a great leader, you had to go and study somewhere. You had to go to Harvard or you had to go to some of these other great schools like the UVA, my alma mater. And I think for a lot of us, we would do well to remember that we exhibit leadership, and a lot of communities exhibit leadership on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm.
And that social and leadership acumen that people acquire by virtue of their cultural pathway is cultural genius. So queer people have a cultural genius, and I'm not here to suggest that only queer people have a cultural genius. There are a lot of different groups that have shown grit and resilience and mettle and strength and ingenuity
Yeah,
in a number of different ways. I'm
sure.
just saying that our community packages it differently, and it's something that I think people should be talking more about. It can be resonant for a number of people. So that cultural genius is again the intellectual and leadership capacity that we have that we've learned simply by being LGBTQ in a society that's hostile to who we are. How to be again adaptive, how to be resourceful, how to be strategic. Those are the things that you learn when you're walking through, when you become LGBT or when you identify as LGBTQ plus. So I just think about, for example, when I was coming up in and walking through different neighborhoods. So where I grew up in the north side of Milwaukee, and I've spent time in other parts of the world as well. The type of perceptiveness that you have to have just walking through different neighborhoods, knowing where you can perhaps share a bit more about who you are, where sometimes you have to be a little bit more thoughtful because you don't know if it's going to be a safe environment, how you engage with people, how you detect and relate to other people in your community, knowing that you may not be able to use the customary cues and language that other people would use to identify with members of their community. All those types of things, I think, are really part of, once again, that cultural genius, that capacity that we naturally have in order to be successful, in order to achieve a certain outcome. And that's what leadership is. It's about how do you achieve a certain outcome by making sure at the same time that you're generating positive impact and you're leaving people in a better place than they were before. That's what the queer community has been able to do. And it's something that's been unheralded and has not been talked about because, again, when we think about leadership, we think it's something that's only owed to or held by people in a certain position, people with a certain pedigree, and people from a certain background. And I would say to your audience and to you and to anyone who's listening that we all have the opportunity to learn from communities around us. So we don't, I'm not saying that you shouldn't go to a business school, let's say in the Northeast or on the West Coast, but we can also learn great leadership skills from those around us who have been able to really build a safe space for themselves within our world. And so that's what I mean by the cultural genius. There's things that each community and culture possess. They are, I think, are instructive for the rest of the world and the rest of our population.
Okay. Joel, you mentioned that you grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think you said.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you talk to me or share a little bit about your background? What puts you on the path that you're on today?
I think a couple of things. Number one, I was raised by a mother who exhibited great leadership. And so it's been surprising. It was surprising to me at one point as I got older to be in institutions, schools, businesses, among different networks where I didn't see that same type of leadership exhibited. So that's number one. Number two, that same mother also taught me that anybody who came into the home is someone that is not only family, their community, but someone you can learn from. My mother was a hospital administrator. So we had people coming to the house who were from all parts of the world. So from Pakistan, from the Philippines, from
Okay.
parts of Western Europe. So that global mindedness and that connection to people from different backgrounds was also very important. It was ingrained in me to the point where I find it odd when I meet people and they don't have friends who are from different parts of the world or different walks of life. I think also as a little Black queer kid growing up in the north side of Milwaukee, there was always the question of who am I? Where do I belong?
Okay.
And the questions around Blackness were fairly obvious because I had other people in the house who were Black who could tell me, this is where you come from. This is what your people have achieved. These are the things that you should know in order to survive. And these are the cultural gifts that will allow you to be successful and the things that you should hold near and dear to your heart. Those questions weren't obvious and present and clear on the queer side. So there was always a part of me that wanted to learn more about that part of myself. So in part, what led me on this journey was self-discovery and self-expression. Who am I? And as I started to interact with more queer people, there were some things that we knew intuitively there's some things that we communicate implicitly, like what does it mean to be, but there wasn't a whole lot out there that said, this is something that you should celebrate about yourself, or these are some things that are really gifts that you bring to the world. And so I want to make it more clear and explicit for young people, particularly people in parts of the world where they're not being affirmed, where they're not being taken care of. So I would say all those things have led me on this journey to not only think about leadership at a critical level, think about how we could create a better world, but also how can we understand queer people at a deeper level, which I think again affirms who they are and really sees and honors the gifts and talents that we bring to larger society.
When was it that you've decided? When was it that you realized that you were a member of this queer community?
Oh, that's a really great question.
And what did you do about it? What did your mother have to say about it?
I always realized I was different. I'm going to say weird, and I say weird affectionately when I was 4. Yeah. I was weird when I was 4.
Okay.
But I didn't have the language for it. So there's no one, when you come out and when you identify as a queer person, at least at the time, at least in where I was, there was no manual to say, this is how you do it. And there was no article or magazine to say, this is what it is. So I spent a lot of years questioning, stumbling, and a lot of years, frankly, not coming out because my ideas of what it meant to be queer were stereotypical. So I thought I had to this type of music, or I would see these representations in the media that were negative. And so that's not me. I think and operate a little bit differently, but what I'm seeing seems to only address or speak to one slice of the community. And so when I finally, at some point, came out in to say the second year of college, I would
Okay.
love to tell you that my family and friends threw me a party and said, hey, this is great and let's celebrate this, but that wasn't the case. So it took some time for the family to get adjusted to it. I would say now my mom was my biggest supporter. She's my biggest fan. And she's been the biggest enabler of my success. So my family is pretty supportive. They're all excited for this book and what I've been able to do, but it's a journey. And I think, again, if people have a more comprehensive and in-depth view of what the community is, then I think a lot of families and I think a lot of people in society wouldn't have some of the bias that they have because people look at the queer community as being focused only on sex and sexuality. They see us as trying to upset this new conversation around gender and gender pronouns, which is, of course, these are not new discussions. And those things are very important. And that's not who we are in our entirety. I think if I had a book like this and there was a resource like this when I was coming out, I'm not going to say that it would have been easy, but I think it would have been easier because I think people would understand that, number one, we're not just caricatures. And I think for me, I would have had a more robust understanding of myself and I would have had more confidence and I would have felt more assured of my identity. I got there eventually. It just took some time. And given the risk of suicide that, given the society that we live in, I don't think we can wait for or just leave it a chance that young people, especially when there are things such as drugs and alcohol, and sometimes people might have mental health issues. We can't take for granted that people are going to get to the finish line. We need to make sure that whatever resources they need are there now, particularly for trans youth, so that they don't have to spend years, as I did, thinking, struggling, and wondering, what does it mean to be me and is it okay? They can actually have that type of support from the jump.
You talk about your mother and how she supported you. What about your father?
Not as supportive. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because my father now is fighting and dealing with the last stages of cancer. And so it's been a very surreal journey with him because we haven't historically been very close. And now that he's by the end, rebuilding that relationship and realizing that there's some things that will never be rebuilt because he's very, how should I put it? He's very committed to his views of life and his views of religion. My concern with that is he'll say to me, for example, I'm concerned about you in the afterlife. And I say, I'm concerned about you in this life because I think the challenge for a number of people who have very stringent conservative spiritual views is not recognizing that we do have an obligation to evolve. And we have to recognize that if your spiritual beliefs do not lead you to a practice of love and compassion, then I think something is off and something is wrong. And people, of course, are free to think and feel whatever they want. But that's where my father has been. And so my father has not been the supporter, the advocate, the champion that I would have wanted him to be. But fortunately, I had other father figures, namely my grandfather, my uncles, and other people in the community who stepped in and filled that void, who have always been there, who've always said, be who you are. And that was, in fact, the lesson that I got from my grandfather, who, having grown up in the Mississippi Delta, I'm sure he probably knew of gay people and queer people, but at the time and in that community, there wasn't the language and there wasn't the visibility. And my grandfather said to me at some point, around that same time that I came out, which was in 1995, he said, be who you are. Your grandfather supports you. And those words were so important to me that at that point, I didn't care what anybody else had to say because my grandfather was like a giant. When your grandfather speaks, at least when my grandfather spoke, it was like a titan had issued some declaration. My grandmother the same way. So I was able to get the support that I needed and get the affirmation that I needed, such that at this stage in the game, I don't need my father's affirmation. I didn't need his support. I was able to get it elsewhere. And I'm not gonna say I'm okay with him having his level of his spiritual beliefs, in some instances, his bigotry, but I know that it ultimately won't stop me from doing what I need to do to live the life that I want. And that's the important lesson for any young person listening here is you can't be concerned, you can't control what other people think, but none of it, if you are able to do what you need to do, take care of yourself, can have any lasting impact on your life and what you can achieve if you put the right people around you.
Okay. And that gets to leadership, doesn't it?
It does. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about what it means to be a transformational leader, Joel, and how does the LGBTQ community exhibit transformational leadership?
The transformational leader is one who's not just focused on themselves, but they're focused on the environment, the community, the people around them. They're there to uplift others and to make sure that each person is able to reach their full potential and that each person is able to feel psychologically safe within their environment. That's what a transformational leader is. They transform, they don't just conform to the environment. Let's look at an example. So, one of my favorite sheroes, if you will, is Barbara Jordan. And I'm sure you know who Barbara Jordan is. Barbara Jordan is probably one of the most accomplished civil servants in the history of the United States.
Yeah.
And she did so by doing a number of things. She exhibited self mastery by, number one, knowing her limits, by being unapologetic about who she was, by being committed and determined to support the communities that she represented, and by doing so in a way where she operated within the system where she was, that being the US Congress, but she was able to push boundaries and to remain faithful to her values and to know who she was at a core level. That type of leadership is what's in the queer community all the time. And that is, of course, and Barbara Jordan is, of course, a member, a humble, a quiet member of the community. She wasn't someone who was boisterous about her identity, but she was a member of the community. And so it's that type of leadership that I think is sorely in need. And that is the type of transformational leadership that you have, where it's not about grabbing attention, grabbing headlines, but it's about how can I make others better? The measure of leadership is a legacy that you leave behind. And whether you're talking about ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, whether you're talking about Barbara Jordan, whether you're talking about the ballroom culture, which we're starting to read and people are starting to learn more about, which actually existed in the 19th century. It existed right after the Civil War, where you had hundreds and hundreds of people within the queer community who decided they wanted to do something to support themselves, but also to make sure that they protected young people who were estranged from their families. And they took people in who didn't have food or money or shelter and created these new family units where people could survive and people could feel good about themselves. That's transformational leadership. And so history is replete with examples of queer people taking those types of steps, being selfless and being transformational to impact others around them. And again, there might be someone listening to this saying, this person's trying to act as though queer people are only people who've done these types of things. No, we're not. But our contribution has been under-recognized and undervalued. And that's what this book is designed to do, is to fill that void.
Why is it timely right now?
I think it's timely right now for two reasons. One, as I said before, because we're at a crucible and we're at a crucial moment where leadership, I think, is sagging, and what has worked in the past, even I think it's even questionable to say this worked in the past, it's certainly not working now. So that's number one. Number two, I think because of the increasing diversity of our world, the leadership models that used to serve a very small percentage of people are not going to be useful for the new workforce, the new constituency that we have out there in society. So when you're talking about women, people of color, LGBTQ, but even if you're not POC, LGBTQ, women identified, I think even for, let's say, the cis hetero white male, I think the leadership models are just not working. And then number three, given the issues that we have around climate change, around extremism, polarization, the economy, and the inflation, there's tons of things that are going on right now which require us to have a different type of leadership. So that's why this is telling right now, not the least of which is the fact that we have a community that is being targeted and is facing unprecedented levels of recrimination and discrimination. And it's time for us to do something different to protect not only that community, but to raise all of ourselves collectively to a higher level.
As we look ahead at the coming election in 2024, Joel, do you see any of the candidates who could possibly be supportive of the issues that you're concerned about?
It depends on what side we're talking about. Are we talking about the Democratic side, the Republican side, the Independent side, Green Party?
Take a look at all three if you want to.
Yeah, let's do that. So let's start with the Democratic side. I think the president has, from his early days in supporting same-sex marriage, for reinstituting a lot of the executive orders that protect the LGBTQ community, to the policy that have been passed in some of the government offices to support LGBTQ employees. I do think we have a friend, a supporter, and a strong ally in the Biden administration. I think also with Kamala Harris, I think we have a supporter, but that doesn't mean that people can't do more. And I'm a big proponent of that. You don't just call yourself an ally. It's what have you done for me lately? You have to continue to do more and think about what can I do to make sure that people are protected. I'm not sure who the independent candidates will be at this particular point. On the Republican side, I see no one, and I do mean no one, particularly from a presidential standpoint, who I think is going to be an ally, supporter, and advocate for this community. Unfortunately, we saw the debate last week that was in Milwaukee, of course, my hometown. And you have people who, if they can't even come out and say that they will disassociate from someone who's been indicted on charges of interfering with an election,
Yeah.
then I think we're hard pressed to think that they would do anything to support the LGBTQ community. I think they're too invested in, they're being very Machiavellian. They want to win at all costs. And that means turning down any progressive legislation, agenda, program, anything designed to help those who are marginalized. And so I have absolutely no confidence in the Republican Party at this point. And I want to be very clear, the Republican Party at one point, I believe, had some reasonable people and some reasonable actors. It's now become an extremist party. And I don't think there's anybody in the party at the leadership at this point that is seriously invested in helping out, not just queer people, but the American population. And I have serious reservations about the Democratic Party at times, but I don't question the morality. I don't question the desire. I don't question the intent. All of those things I think are missing from the Republican side. And I think we're seeing a very autocratic party. And I actually worry more about this notion that, we've seen it in some of the polls and some of the surveys where people are saying that they're willing to defend the quote unquote country at all costs, which means that they're willing to target anyone who disagrees with their way of thinking. Who typically is targeted in those types of instances: LGBTQ plus people, people of color, women, and anybody who dares to disagree or dares to be independent in their thinking. So I think it actually represents a very scary time for us. And I'm not looking forward to 2024, not only because I don't want to just get all the leaflets and pamphlets and all the junk mail and the debates that really don't talk about substantive issues, but are just more about showboating. I'm concerned about the election. And I don't know how at this time in our country's history that people could even have a question as to how to move forward, or which candidate or which party would represent this country's best interest best. You have one party that's being very autocratic. You have another party that I think is trying to do its very best, but of course has issues, and I think needs to do more to not just care about minorities when it comes to the election cycle, But I think in terms of their morality and their positionality, I think it's night and day. And so it's a concern for me because there still seems to be a tangible threat that the Republican Party can actually retake the White House in 2024, as bizarre as that may seem. So I'm nervous and we'll see what happens, but I'll be out there on the political trail supporting candidates that I think support not only a progressive agenda, not only support kids and fighting poverty and those sorts of things, but also those, of course, who support the LGBTQ plus community.
Okay. So where can people find your book, Joel, and how can they reach out to you if they want to?
People can reach me. I'm not as popular on social media as I used to be. I've gotten rid of a lot of social media, but you can always find me on my websites. You can find me at joeldavisbrown.com. You can also find me at my business website. That's pneumos.com. That's spelled P as in Papa, N as in November, EU, M as in Mary, O, S as in Sam.com. You can find me on Instagram as well at Joel A. Brown. And I think if you look in those places, you'll be able to not only purchase a copy of the book. The book is doing very well. It was number one in 4 categories on Amazon. And we're completing an audiobook. So you'll be able to hear me or experience the book differently, probably by October, if you are not a book reader and you care to listen to the audiobook. So that will be coming out in the fall. So in any of those places, you can reach me. You can also reach me on LinkedIn as well.
Are you doing the recording?
I am, yes.
Good for you. That's interesting. All right. It's been a pleasure having you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close up?
The thing I would reiterate is you don't have to be queer to appreciate and to get something from this book, just queer-minded, which means that you're open to new ways of thinking. And so if you get the book, please recommend it to your neighbors and friends. Please use it as a guide, not just as a showpiece to sit on your mantle or sit in your library. So I want people to actually use it, read it, apply what's there, ask questions, and of course, continue to get to know the community, because I think the best learning happens when you actually engage the community in real and tangible ways to learn more about its journey and who it is and what it has been. So with that, I just want to thank you for creating the space for me to be here with you. You've asked some very thoughtful questions, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with any of your listeners in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, Joel. Now, you guys hang on for a sec. I'll be right back with some closing comments. Hey guys, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you'll come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. Our episodes stream weekly, every Monday. Let your friends know about this podcast and take a minute to subscribe. Just go to podcast.leantotheleft.net to subscribe, check out the upcoming interview schedule, and listen to all of our episodes. And follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left Podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at BobGaddy_Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. And you can watch the episodes at YouTube at Lean to the Left. And don't forget to visit our blog site, leantotheleft.net, where you'll find commentary on the news by some excellent writers with progressive perspectives on a whole range of topics. You can sign up as a member there, and of course, it's all free. Now, this is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.